Sega and Namco, two of the most prolific names in the industry with incredible legacies spanning decades, especially when it comes to the early to mid 90s when they were making huge strides in bringing 3D to the arcades. Namco first experimented with games like Winning Run and Driver's Eyes on the System 21 board, before releasing Ridge Racer in 1993 on System 22. Sega AM2's Virtua Racing debuted on Model 1 in 1992, before dropping Daytona USA on the Model 2 in 1994. These games made their mark for pretty much the same reasons. They brought the thrill of racing to the arcades, looking and feeling more lifelike than ever before. But now, with the passage of time, let's just say that both these games aren't exactly state of the art anymore. But today, I don't want to focus on their legacy, their technology, or their impact on gaming as a whole, otherwise it'd take me another 3 years to upload. In this video, I just want to take a laid-back look at what separates them just as video games, and judge whether they're still worth playing. How exactly do their differences in art style, music, handling, and track design define these two experiences? And most importantly, which one holds up better today? Before we start, I must make clear what I'm actually comparing here. There's a few different versions of both these games, but I'm comparing the arcade version of Ridge Racer through MAME to the PS3 version of Daytona on RPCS3, though I've more extensively played the 360 version on real hardware. I just thought it was important to note, since Ridge Racer is being played with a controller it wasn't designed for, in this case a DualShock 4 and a DualSense instead of a racing wheel. Daytona is also not being played with a wheel, but this is a home version made just for the HD consoles, tuning the controls to work perfectly for their standard gamepads. Using the default settings in Model 2 emulator, one might expect it to handle like the HD version, but it absolutely does not. The sensitivity is unplayably touchy. So if you know a thing or two about how such emulators work, you'd probably assume that Ridge Racer would succumb to the same fate, but it thankfully doesn't. We'll get to the specifics later, but rest assured, I don't think the comparisons I'm about to make are unfair to Ridge Racer. If you ask me, this is the best way to play the original game, short of buying an arcade 1-up cabinet. So now that we're past the preamble ramble, let's get stuck into it, and I think it'd be best to start with the first game released out of the duo. Ridge Racer, released in Japanese arcades on October 30th, 1993. The impact that this game and its technology had on the industry, well, it's hard to fathom. Not only did it bring a fresh take on 3D racing to the arcades, it also jump-started the PlayStation brand with its home release just over a year later, with varying results, but that's a video for another time. What's important right now is the original game in its original form, or at least as close as I can get with a PC, and man, what a form it takes. Namco's arcade classic is still one of the finest the arcade racing genre has to offer, even when compared to later games in the Ridge Racer series. It's brimming with personality as soon as you pop a credit in, with the game delivering a hearty After that exclamation, you get a paltry selection of racetracks, or rather, racetrack, in one of 3 difficulty modes, with the 4th option being a time trial mode. Yeah, despite all the graphical power that Namco had at their disposal, they didn't seem to have an abundance of content on the mind while making this game. Yes, the advanced difficulty and time trial modes house a variation of the end of the track, and yes, the higher top speeds and the higher difficulties can add a bit of spice, but its lacking variety is definitely a sore spot these days. However, I will say that despite the sheer lack of content, that hardly matters when that single track will absolutely hypnotize you. This game has less stuff in it than even most SNES and Mega Drive races, yet the way it executes its fundamentals is so good, feeling almost as fresh today as it was back then. Even though it's one of, if not the first racing game with brake-to-drift mechanics, its age does nothing to hinder its controls, even on a gamepad. However, I perfectly get if this looks a bit iffy, especially if you're used to the PS1 version, later games in the series, or even just modern arcade races in general. Just watching me play it does look a bit weird with a control stick, like it's a bit too touchy, but I think if you stick with it, it becomes second nature after not long at all. I'll always defend the drifting in the PS1 version, since it's still manageable with some practice, but it's still really clunky no matter what, particularly in third person. It's slow, really easy to over or undercorrect, exiting the drift can be confusing, it can be a bloody pain for some. Whereas in the arcade version, it couldn't be any more different. You engage it swiftly, make adjustments on a dime, and exit smoothly without much hassle. Considering its age and the sheer amount of things it was pioneering all at once, it's hard to fault it. If anything, I think it's aged remarkably well. I mean, racing games as a genre are pretty simple, so if you can nail the fundamentals in an exciting, engaging way and present it with a sense of style, you have a pretty memorable experience if nothing else. And I think this game is such a perfect example of that. I can't think of any other racing games, except maybe Sonic Riders, where I've just had such pure, unbridled fun shaving even just milliseconds off lap times in the time trial mode. The track design acts in near perfect harmony with the controls, featuring ample opportunity to power slide around corners at high speed. In fact, if you've played it as much as I have, you can drift around certain corners, such as this one, with only a slight tyre screech. Ridge Racer's original course is iconic, not just because it's fantastic to race on, but because of the numerous reappearances it'd make throughout the series. A good race in this game is like being in a state of high-intensity zen, to borrow a phrase. It's a state of mind where your brain just absolutely switches off, steering, accelerating and drifting without much conscious thought, all while your heart races and you're dead focused. It's something I can't find an adequate way to explain, especially to someone who's never played the game at all before. I mean, it happens to various degrees when playing all kinds of racing games, but Ridge Racer was able to get its hooks into me in ways most other racers don't. Despite having no nostalgia for it and having already played games like F-Zero GX and Midnight Club 3, Ridge Racer grabbed me and did not let go. And I'm not just talking about the controls and track design either, I'm talking about that killer soundtrack, composed by Namco's dream team of VGM legends Shinji Hosoe, Ayako Sasso, and Nobuyoshi Sano. Sliding around the track wouldn't be the same without earworms like Speedster, Feeling Over, or the often imitated but never duplicated Rare Hero being blasted alongside it. There's 6 music tracks in total, selectable by moving the gear shift up or down at mode select, and I couldn't imagine Ridge Racer with any other soundtrack for a second. There's just something deeply enthralling about doing 200 Ks while hearing the most unhinged GABA masterpiece of all time, Rotterdam Nation, tearing through the ambience and car engine noise. Oh, and that always enthusiastic announcer as well, giving off infectious positivity whenever he delivers a line of his.
Woo! That was a great counter! You must be one genius of a driver. You've got to teach me!
Do you know that this guy not only voiced Shirudo Garo and a bunch of enemies in Time Crisis, but also Harry Mason from Silent Hill, and Dracula from Symphony of the Night? Yeah, I'm not kidding, look it up. And lastly, the graphics, while technically impressive for their time just being in 3D, time hasn't been so kind to them, but I personally don't think that has to be a problem. If you ask me, the crude parts of this game's graphics and animation almost give it a cartoony sensibility about its presentation, and those car models with their low polygon counts and simple shapes are just so charming to look at. But ignoring the dated parts of its presentation, there's just so much detail all over the place. You can pause at so many points in the track and you'd more than likely have something pretty to look at. Skyscrapers, lighthouses, construction sites, so many little things to see that you'd probably never notice during a regular playthrough. All while running at a rock-solid 60 FPS at 480i in the cabinet and in 480p on MAME, so it all looks clean and sharp. The PS1 version does look pretty close, especially considering how much cheaper the hardware is and the fact it's a launch title, but it's clear that the low-res warping textures and 240p render resolution brought about by the PS1 hardware results in an experience that's nowhere near as pleasing. Even the Turbo Mode disc that came with Ridge Racer Type 4, while it certainly looks better, closer to the original, it only just misses the mark, especially since it overdoes the shading if you ask me. It doesn't look quite right with how dark some parts are. And that's ignoring the fact that you basically only have the time trial races in this version with no 12-car fleet in sight. So yeah, if you ask me, Ridge Racer stands the test of time wonderfully for its age and lack of content. If the Ridge Racer experience is that high-intensity zen you feel, melting in front of the screen as you let the music and that sense of speed wash over you, then this game does it the best. Ridge Racer 5 comes damn close, but the music knocks it down a few pegs since I'm not really the biggest fan of its soundtrack. I totally understand if you don't like it, it's certainly not for everyone, but I think it's got more appeal than it's given credit for, especially since the arcade version remains obscured outside the PS1 version spotlight, doing an incredible disservice to the game and its legacy if you ask me. So yeah, if the prospect of arcade racing with that tinge of early 90s irreverence interests you, then I'd wholeheartedly recommend Ridge Racer without question. If only Namco would contract M2 to do a port of it to current consoles or something. But thankfully, the next game on the agenda did get a fantastic home port to the PS3 and 360 in 2011. Sega AM2's Daytona USA is an influential phenom, standing alongside Ridge Racer as one of the most important arcade racing games of all time. The Japanese location test was so successful that Sega prepared a full-scale Japanese launch and North American debut in March of 1994 before the rest of the world got it that April. These two really were a huge 1-2 punch of graphical power and arcade racing that really showed the revolution that was brewing in the industry at the time. And Daytona is such a big part of the 3D boom happening in the mid-90s. That is, in the arcades at least. Unlike Ridge Racer's enormous success on the PlayStation, the original port of Daytona on the Saturn didn't do much to impress, comparatively at least. It's still a relatively decent version of the game that you could get the hang of, but it's certainly not optimal, and nowhere near as graphically impressive as Ridge Racer on PS1. Even though it was relegated to the arcades for the longest time, it's been very successful at capturing the imagination, so much so that it almost single-handedly made the Model 2 one of Sega's most profitable system boards. And there's a good reason why it left a big impact on all those who played it back in the day, and even these days. I'm sure you've already heard the game's memorable theme song many times throughout retro gaming YouTube. It's so iconic that putting it in a video like this is really all you need to communicate what Daytona is all about, from its historical impact to the game itself. And speaking of, well, the game itself. When you first start, you're given a selection of beginner, advanced, and expert tracks, similar to Ridge Racer. The HD version does have time trials, but it's in a separate menu away from the arcade mode since it wasn't included in the original game. Beginner is based off of Daytona International Speedway, but isn't quite the same, earning itself the name 37 Speedway. Advanced is known as Dinosaur Canyon, providing a stiff challenge, and then the expert track, Seaside Street Galaxy, is a pretty tough endurance. And as soon as you jump into it, the impending race makes clear the kind of experience this is. If Ridge Racer is that high-intensity zen I was talking about, then Daytona is an ultra-intensity migraine, because seriously, this game takes no prisoners. Daytona's control scheme is way more involved than Ridge Racer's ever was. It emulates the little details about driving that Ridge Racer takes liberties with or just doesn't do at all. In Ridge Racer, you're driving what's essentially an oversized go-kart, whereas in Daytona, you're instead driving a car with real car characteristics. It can spin out, the tires can slip from abusing the throttle after a drift, the turning circle gets wider as you go faster, etc. The drift isn't as slidey as it is in Ridge Racer as well. I mean, you will do some pretty gnarly power slides without losing much speed, but it's not like you can dart around a 90-degree corner without a care in the world. Daytona's drift is a lot heavier and requires you to slow down and take more care around corners, since the drift has a lot more inertia to it. It's these little details that add up to make a driving experience that feels a bit more realistic than Ridge Racer. I'm almost tempted to call it an early example of a simcade. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still an arcade racer at heart, but its attention to detail gives it a few simulation-esque qualities about it in a way that's honestly pretty unique. Then there's the matter of AI. In Ridge Racer, the computer pretty rigidly follows a set racing line along the track for most of the race, only occasionally diverting from it to overtake or block every once in a while. And while they have higher top speeds, they have to compensate by taking extra time to slow down and prepare a drift, and speeding back up when they exit a drift. So when you're supposed to overtake is pretty clearly telegraphed to you in the grand scheme of things, since each car's strengths and weaknesses are pretty obvious. Whereas in Daytona, every car is pretty much the same as yours, only just very slightly slower. They otherwise turn the same, drift the same, brake the same, so you can't rely on the opponent's car's weaknesses as a crutch to overtake when the game tells you to. In Daytona, you have to fight for every edge possible. It demands the player hone their skills well, especially on the arcade difficulty. The AI in Daytona is also a bit more aggressive. They'll anticipate your approach, regularly trying to block and overtake, and they'll even attack other racers from time to time. Sure, it's not that much more advanced than Ridge Racer's AI, but it's noticeable, and it's enough to change the dynamics of when and how you take risks. And then there's the track design. While Ridge Racer's original track is iconic in its own right, Daytona has literally 3 times as much content, with its wholly unique courses comprising 3 distinct levels of difficulty. The first stage eases you into learning a simple drift at the end of the course. The second sees you refining your drift while learning proper racing lines and overtaking strategies. And then the third requires the most demanding drift, braking techniques, and careful use of throttle in the whole game. All this is to say that there's quite a lot of room for error in Ridge Racer. You can easily adjust your drift, the AI is pretty static and predictable, the controls and tracks don't squeeze much tension out of each other, etc. Daytona's controls, AI, and tracks come together to create a game that's 10 times harder to get right, but 10 times more satisfying to nail in my opinion. Before I started this video, I'd been playing a lot of Ridge Racer just casually on and off over the course of a couple of months or so, and hadn't touched Daytona for a while. So when I revisited Daytona to analyze it, I was shocked to rediscover just how brutal this game is. That's why I described it as a migraine earlier, because this game can get so intense for me that I actually get a slight headache while playing it on occasion. I can't think of a game before or since that's made headaches something to look forward to. That's certainly an achievement. Ridge Racer is high intensity in its own way, don't get me wrong, but Daytona takes it to a whole other level. When you play it, you almost get the feeling of a tightrope walk. It requires a lot of patience to get right, even when the rope isn't that far off the ground. And when you get good enough to take more of a risk with the rope suspended higher up, there's so much that can go wrong if you make even the slightest mistakes. Crashing in Ridge Racer means losing your speed and perhaps a place or two, but Daytona punishes you greatly, sending you back several places in one go if your mistakes are severe enough. And the track design combined with the drift mechanics makes catching back up quite a bit more of a long, nail-biting process, where you'll end up paying for mistakes you made a whole lap or two ago. But that's okay, since you'll keep coming back to practice. The game's smooth controls, charming graphics, and unforgettable soundtrack by VGM legend Takenobu Mitsuyoshi will make you want to come back to practice whether you get good or not. Much like Ridge Racer, the soundtrack in particular really helps to elevate this game into something special. Its bouncy, fast-paced sound serves to highlight its palpably uncomfortable yet cathartic tension, while also being some of the most cheesy, whimsical fun you can have with a sound chip. It's a pretty impressive technical feat too, since the music actually has lyrics in it, with the vocals cut up into samples small enough to fit on a few megabytes of ROM space. All in all, it's a fantastic game, one of my favourite games of all time, let alone one of my favourite races. It's easily in my top 3 favourite races, perhaps even my all-time favourite. Everything comes together in such a way very few races can match. The music, the graphics, the gameplay. Even thinking about it brings me warm feelings, almost nostalgic in a way, despite not having played the game until I was an adult. That being said, how well does it stack up to Ridge Racer? I'd say very well, to the point that I do actually prefer it to Ridge Racer. You might not, and I perfectly get why. Ridge Racer occupies basically the same place in my heart that Daytona does, so even if I do prefer it, it's not by much. I really did have to think about it for a bit. The sheer joy I feel when I play either of these games makes me feel that the preference hardly matters. So in saying that, play both of them. Whether you want to experience history or even just to play some fun racing games, you can't go wrong with either of them. Daytona is still on XBLA. It's even backwards compatible on newer Xboxes. If you're on the other side of the fence, you can get it on PS3 for $12, which this is the version I emulated to capture footage for this video. Ridge Racer, on the other hand, has unfortunately drawn the short straw. The only way you can play it legally is to buy an arcade 1-up cabinet or the PS1 version on eBay. I'm legally obligated to say that doing some yar-har fiddle-dee-dee is bad and everything, but at this point it's your only practical recourse for playing it, especially the arcade version. And even then, Daytona could soon suffer the same fate. There's no telling when it'll get delisted from either PSN or XBLA, so I'd recommend emulating that one as well if you can. Again, I'm not advocating piracy, wink wink, and I'd love to tell you where I got my copies of both these games from, but I can't, and I won't. It's a real shame that, as of this video, you can't play one of the most important games of all time legally without buying a giant, expensive wooden casket. But regardless of how you choose to do it, both of these games are very much worth the trouble of seeking them out if you ask me. I can't say it enough that you really should experience both of these games if you're interested. Whether you're into arcade games, racing games, or video games in general, they both have historical impact and engrossing gameplay to make them worth your time in 2023. It may be a bit of an unsatisfying answer to hear that, but it's just how I feel about it, and honestly, I think you're missing out if you haven't played both of them. They're testament to the kind of simple fun that Namco and Sega were capable of creating, to the point they almost make it seem effortless. They feel like the games that the two giants were building up to for a whole decade. Sega went from Turbo to Virtual Racing to Daytona, and Namco went from Pole Position to Winning Run to Ridge Racer. Seeing that decade-long evolution and what their numerous racing classics led up to is nothing short of amazing. It's fascinating to trace that unstoppable march of technology, enabling new experiences that were special, long-lasting, and stayed with you forever. You know, someone should make a video about it.